Good evening. And welcome everyone. My name is Edward Kopp. I'm the Chief Curator here at the Menil Drawing Institute, and it's our great pleasure to welcome you for tonight's talk with Kate Shepherd. And first, I'd like to thank Kate for coming down from New York. We're so glad to be able to welcome you for a few days here in Houston. Also, I'd like to thank the Cockrell family, who's been funding this lecture series this year, so we're very grateful. And initiated in 2018, the Artist Talk series is meant to offer the public the opportunity to hear directly from artists whose works are included in the collection here at the Menil. And up next in this series, there will be a talk with William T. Williams on March the 3rd. And to learn more about this program and much more, please visit our website at menil.org. So Kate's talk this evening is held in conjunction with the current exhibition, Spatial Awareness, Drawings from the Permanent Collection, in which two of Kate's recently acquired drawings are featured. And the exhibition is on view until March 13th, and it will remain open for a few minutes after this talk. So in case you haven't seen it or would like to see it again, feel free to do so. And before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence your cell phones if you haven't done so already. We are recording this program, and it will be made available on the YouTube channel of the Menil in the upcoming weeks. Kate has kindly agreed to take questions at the end, so there'll be time for that. And if you could please hold your questions until the end, that would be great. So it's my genuine pleasure to introduce artist Kate Shepherd. She was born in New York City, where she currently lives and works, and she received a BA from Oberlin College, and then her MFA from the School of Visual Arts in New York. And throughout her career, she has investigated abstracted spaces. Using often thin, crisp lines, she has attempted to articulate space and the spectator's experience of it, whether it is a hypothetical space or our own space, or both. She's worked across several media, painting, drawing, and printmaking, but one could say that the element of drawing as a structure and as a mode of formal rigor is a constant throughout her work. She's given a lot of thought to one of the mysteries or paradoxes of the drawing medium, namely that it can suggest three-dimensional space, yet while being confined in most cases in two dimensions. Color is often a key component of her work, and so is surface finish. And we all love lusciously slick paintings. Kate has exhibited her work in museums across the country and abroad since the early 1990s. Her solo museum exhibitions include Kate Shepherd, Lineaments at the Charlotte and Philip Haynes Art Gallery, Wake Forest University in North Carolina, and Intersections, Relation to and Yet Not Homage to Mondrian at the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Her works are in the collections of the Los Angeles Country Museum of Art, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Phillips Collection, the Menil Collection, the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and the Albright Knox, and others. Kate has a long-standing commitment to printmaking, and she has made editions with or for base prints, Lower East Side Print Shop, Dieudonné, the Chinati Foundation, and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Her first permanent wall painting in a public space entitled Tricycle Red, Pelican Grey, etc., Partial Octagons, was recently unveiled at Rice University, where it is on view at the Jones Graduate School of Business. And so now please join me in welcoming Kate.
Thank you, everybody, for coming, and thank you for your beautiful introduction, Edouard, and for inviting me to speak. I'm so happy to be here tonight. First, I want to express my gratitude to so many people here at the Menil, including Edouard and Tony Martinez, Kelly Montana, Lauren Pollack, Rebecca Rabineau, Saskia Verlaine, Michelle White, and many others. As well, I'd like to thank Leah Bennett and Michael Now and Stephen Schwartz for generously donating 2 works of mine to the museum. Both are in Saskia Verlaine's beautiful show here, Spatial Awareness, Drawings from the Permanent Collection. Tonight I'd like to talk about an installation that I did with Josh Pazda, Hiram Butler Gallery here in Houston back in April 2020, which seems like another era. I say with instead of at, because like a lot of my work, the piece came from collaboration and exploration. I'll show you what I mean as we go along, but let's get started by setting the scene. My first solo show at Gallery Lalong after 6 years opened on March 12, 2020. Due to COVID, it closed 2 days later. I'm glad you're laughing. The paintings continued to hang in the darkened gallery. At first, the curious and the brave could peek in from outside. Then the gallery's windows were boarded up. Obviously, I was disappointed, but luckily I had something else to look forward to. I was hoping to do a show that summer with Pazda Butler Gallery. Then everything fell apart even more. The whole world was going, whoops. The whole world was going into further lockdown, and it looked like the show would be postponed or even canceled. By late March, I couldn't go to my studio in Brooklyn, so I couldn't make the work, I couldn't ship the work, and the gallery would probably be closed anyway. But I continued to think about it. I was hoping to build on an idea from the show in New York. So if you've seen my enamel paintings, you know that they're not static. As you move, the paintings reflect the room and change as the light hits from different angles. That experience had been my inspiration for the show at Lalong. I isolated reflective shapes on a sanded surface. Each time the painting was seen, it would be different. Previously, my work always used fine lines to describe the subject matter, but this time I decided to let the contrast of the surfaces create the image and the space. As much as we looked at the paintings were looking back at us. I called this one Pocket Watch because the reflections are like eyes peering outwards, but the shapes reminded me of pockets on an old-fashioned shirt. This painting is called Surveillance. It was the last painting I made, and it was the key to the whole show. The point is not that the paintings use both shiny and not shiny paint. The point is that the surface of the paintings and the world they reflect have a living relationship. The room, the quality of light, and where the viewer stands all create the experience of the piece. That idea turned out to be the seed that grew into the show in Houston. But there wasn't much I could do from lockdown. It was hard to imagine when things would be able to open again. Still, I was determined to keep the ball rolling. It was just the kind of creative challenge I needed to make me feel alive and hopeful again. So I got on the phone with Josh Pazda in Houston. I said, you know that show we were going to do? Let's do it. I don't care. I don't care if the gallery is closed. I have an idea that can work, and let's just do it together. So I just, I hope that's okay, Josh. I love the shirt. I decided to figure out a wall painting and direct the execution from New York City. Josh volunteered to paint it for me, and that was the beginning of a great partnership. We defied the downside of social distancing and became a tight team. So separation became collaboration. This is the interior of the gallery. I wanted to make something beautiful, but also unsettling. It had to be viewable from outside the closed gallery, and I wanted the viewer to be an active part of the piece. At this point, I didn't know how to do any of that. I was searching for a way to make an illusion. I've done wall paintings before, but this time I wanted to change the whole room. As you can see, the space is set up with 3 walls facing the entrance. It's like a proscenium stage. The viewer would only be able to see the piece by looking through the windows. As an artist, you don't usually get that much control. Usually the viewer can move freely. Here's a mural I did recently at Rice University. Since it's in a hallway, the piece is more about rhythm and motion. I invented a space that one could walk across and yet seemingly within. It's also based on the architecture of the building. I was copying the shape of the inner rotunda, which has an oculus. Here is a detail that shows the planes of the oculus form turning around. The only other time I've been able to physically place the viewer was for a commission in 2013. I was asked to make an outdoor sculpture on some private land. With the help of 7 stonemasons, I built a small amphitheater on a hillside. The idea was for hikers to sit and behold the view, but also focus on some subtle elements in the distance. Again, the viewer would be a key player. Whoops. I planted 2 discs in the landscape of vastly different sizes, but which appeared to be the same size if someone sitting on the stairs. One disc was blue and the other was orange. I wanted them to look like hovering Skittles or M&Ms. And if you sat exactly at the center of the steps, the blue would eclipse the orange disc. And I found this to be immensely satisfying. So I knew I wanted to respond to the perspective of the viewer. And I also wanted to create a feeling of being outside of ordinary reality. At first, the only thing I had to work with was my memory of the gallery space and a floor plan that Josh sent me. It's a beautiful and spacious gallery, but since the gallery was closed, I had to work within the confines of just the front section. The grid in red represents the actual floor tiles. Luckily, this is the kind of work I could get started on right away on the computer. For years, I've been assisted by a man named Anis, who lives in Palestine. He helps me build various renderings, and here an architectural rendering of the space. We could see each other's screens and talk while the forms evolved. We're in different time zones, so we only had pockets of time to work together. Even though he is halfway around the world, it works surprisingly well. Anis had moved to the Middle East in 2007, so I was already comfortable collaborating from afar. In different styles, we drew the space of the gallery. He and I bounced ideas back and forth. It was like playing chess. It was an interesting problem to visualize. More and more, I wanted to play with the geometry of the space. My ideas started to come from the original diagram that included the floor tile lines. I knew that whatever I came up with, in order to get this done during the pandemic, I had to be practical. So I decided to use regular Benjamin Moore latex house paint instead of my usual oil-based enamel. We began marking up a photo of the gallery. My first idea was to paint rectangles as surrogate paintings, but then I added brown on the wall, continuing the floor upwards. That's when things started to get interesting. I've always found this kind of wall treatment to be beautiful. It creates a natural horizon on any space. This one is above eye level, and this one is below eye level. You often find this treatment in institutions where they paint the wall to a certain level in order to hide scuff marks. But more than just painting up the wall, I wanted to morph the space itself. So I changed the shape of the brown on the back wall. I made it continue in perspective, following the lines of the floor tiles. This made an illusion of a deeper space. And that was a game changer. As soon as I tapped into one-point perspective, it showed how I would treat the rest of the room. But it also left me with a lot of questions. For example, what should I do with the sidewalls? Should we continue the fake perspective? Once the space was broken open, I realized I could do whatever I wanted. On the side walls, I continued the line of the back wall where it met the floor. This way, the walls seemed to change direction. They seemed to flank backwards rather than towards us. So we were partway there. I just had to change the rectangles. By this point, the space was completely reinvented. Now the room created an illusion, but it would only work from one point of view at the center. The next step was to make all the panels rest on the imaginary floor. They were imaginary paintings that looked like doors of a stage set. Next, we started to flesh out the idea in 3 dimensions. We moved the vanishing point away from the center in order to make the room more dynamic. The rendering program called SketchUp let us look at it from different angles. We also pared down the number of fake paintings. Anissa and I moved the SketchUp camera around to see inside from different locations on the porch. I wanted to understand where the illusion would break down. I wanted to see where order became disorder. The viewer would experience these changes depending on where they stood. I cherished the oddness that the wall shapes created. Somehow that disorientation felt right for a piece made during the pandemic. Depending on the day, you'd really have to focus in order to see inside. Despite all our planning, we knew we couldn't control everything. The idea about points of view kept evolving along the way. Here are some markups of how we imagined the viewer would be positioned. So I hope you're starting to see how the idea is developing as we're going along. But in order to explain why and help you understand how the decisions in Houston connect to the rest of my work, we're going to need to look at some background. I want to take you on 2 detours. The first one is about color. Then we will move back to Houston, after which we will take another short detour into form before we wrap it up. Now, if you're familiar with my work, you know that color is a main focus, but I've always been intuitive and exploratory, so how I choose colors changes all the time. Sometimes it's emotional, sometimes there's a physical or intellectual reference. I often use it to make space, but also to convey feelings. My early training was in figurative painting and drawing. I often worked with a limited palette. For example, here I used only Venetian red, yellow ochre, and a cool black, and that appeared blue in relationship to the other paints. I always love a constraint that restricts the game of making. Over time, I found myself paring things down and copying old master paintings. Yes, at times, I was one of those people in the museum with a French easel. Many times. Line became more and more important, and I started to see it differently. Eventually, I gave up painting in a classical academic way entirely. I didn't have anything to say with it, and I felt lost. Then on one of the first days of my residency at the McDowell Colony, I went to a hardware store, and the paint chip samples caught my eye, and I said, bingo, I could draw on those. They were tiny, but again, the constraint appealed to me. This new way of making images took rendering and modeling off the plate, and I could focus on line only. I used recognizable imagery to express intimacy. I felt a new attachment to exploring single colors, just one at a time. This was in the mid to late 90s. The progression of paint chips enabled me to show multiple angles at once, which implied the passage of time. I loved the interplay between the emotional content of the images and the ground color. Skipping forward, that carried through to my paintings on panels. This is a good example of one here at the Menil collection, which I made in 2008. This group of works is abstract, but I want them to feel human in a way. I want them to simulate sculptures. They were all about form, gesture, and energy. I see this one going like this. Michelle has seen me do this before. More like that. Anyway, it's called Yellow Shunning. Instead of being non-objective, the sculptures in these paintings are almost anthropomorphic. Here's a sculpture using the same color. It's at Art Oh My by one of my favorite artists, Robert Grosvenor. It has its own gesture, and the color makes me nostalgic for my childhood. This is one from the same series. It's called Storm King, as in the sculpture park. I wanted it to seem like it was pushing its way outside of a sheath or a cocoon. The red reminds me of growing up in the 70s. I remember things being one color at a time, like the public sculptures of Calder and de Souveraud. I also remember dressing in one color only, head to toe, dress, tights, and shoes. I often get inspiration by color I experience in the outside world. These days, New York City is a construction zone. There's new buildings everywhere, and there is a protocol to how provisional structures can be built and what colors they can be painted. Elements are standardized, so you see them repeatedly all over the city, and yet each work site is still improvised. For example, peepholes into construction areas are a consistent size, but they can be oriented and closed off in different ways. I made this installation for a tiny gallery at 56 Henry Street called 56 Henry. I copied all the colors and tropes to make an homage to the city, and I bought a big lock and a heavy chain at Home Depot. I called the show Bagels and Locks. It was a landscape painting and a love letter to New York City. Sometimes color ideas come from several places at once. This painting is from a series I made with etching ink, part of a show called Battle Zone in 2016. It makes reference to a video game from the 80s. The show is inspired in part by retro video games and night vision goggles. The neon green felt eerie and electric, non-traditional. And the etching ink has its own noisy, impressionistic quality. The title of this painting is Whistler. It's kind of like Night Vision meets Whistler Nocturne. One of my favorite strategies for color is to set up a system and play within it. In 2007, I started a group of screen prints called protest posters. The fraught political climate reminded me of my childhood. I wanted to make a poster, but I didn't want it to have any text on it, just a few repeating shapes printed in layers of transparent colors. And I wanted each one to be unique. I figured out a way to do this with master printer Luther Davis. 15 years later and 3 print shops later, we are still working together, and I still haven't made 2 that are the same, except for once, and that was an accident. In 2010, I made a series of monoprints, all in yellow like the Texas hot sun. Rob Weiner from the Chinati Foundation in Marfa, Texas, had chosen my most limited and restrained print as a prototype for their annual benefit edition, so I made 100 of them. Each one was different, and people bought them without being able to choose. They just got the next one off the pile. The Chinati print was the beginning of making one color at a time. After yellow, I did red, and after red, I did blue. And the blue ones were called Splendor of Duration, Triumph of the Moment. They may look pretty simple, but each series can take up to a year to make, and I do about 100 of each color. By the time Trump was elected in 2016, I had run out of primary colors. I didn't want to do green, and I didn't want to do orange, so I said, screw it, I'm doing purple. It was a chance to reclaim the color of royalty. These are called Protest Violet. And in 2019, I started a new series. Here I wanted 2 things to happen at once. One color scheme is on top of another. Here, the yellow covers the underlying green, and here the purple covers the red and the pink. While making the prints, I learned about Freddy Mamani, the Bolivian architect. He makes buildings with strong, clashing colors. The series was about contrasts and taking charge and a kind of aesthetic authority. The title I chose is Nina Simone Sings Pirate Jenny, based on her version of a song by Kurt Weill and Bertolt Brecht. It's about a woman working in a flop house in Germany imagining violence. Simone moved the action to South Carolina. It became a civil rights protest version of a feminist revenge anthem. It's hard to explain adequately. I recommend you watch it on YouTube. Just Google Nina Simone Sings Pirate Jenny. It's fantastic. My titles always come after the fact. They're a process of recognition rather than a starting point. These prints are simpler and reminded me of Sister Corita Kent. She was a defrocked nun who made art about political protest and spirituality. Bold color gave power to her message. She was fighting for love in the face of political unrest and violence. I had wanted to do a series in gray for years, but my printer said that they would be too similar and we wouldn't be able to get a range. But we figured out how to make a great variety. I guess this was my own form of rebellion. I titled them News, like a parade of front pages of the New York Times. The news was bad then, and it's bad now. It changes, but the color stays the same. Here they are at Pazda Butler Gallery last year. And here's a detail of the overlapping inks. I wanted parts of the prints to look like a box of Polaroid black and white film. Even the types of gray had a range of color, which was really fun to play with. For me, the possibilities are basically infinite once I have a system to work with. It becomes a game of theme and variations. When I found this, I was off and running. It was the inspiration for another series I started in 2007. While I wanted to copy the format, I didn't want the triangle to be equilateral. I would elongate the forms to make them more in keeping with the proportions that I use. For years, I had been printing rectangles to make drawings on, also with Luther Davis. Then one day, I cut the paper into triangles of different colors. And once I had a set to work with, I was free to play. Like the poster prints, each piece is unique, but unlike the poster prints, I could make these anytime in my own studio, and all colors were up for grabs. With this process, the possibilities were really infinite. Here I used pieces cut from complex gradients that I printed. It was actually one color going in one direction and the other color going in the other direction. The unevenness of the printing was intentional. I wanted the surface to have more atmosphere than the solids did. I was embracing the uncertainty. Also, I started improvising beyond the system of the triangle. I was playing with color and form at the same time. I showed a group of these at Pazda Butler Gallery in 2015. I called them chunks. Some of them almost look like corporate logos. But they sometimes created space, too. I liked that some of them hint at sculptural form. Speaking of making space, let's get back to the wall painting. While the shape of the imaginary gallery was coming together, I was still trying to decide which colors to use, and these were just placeholders. I was inspired by this photo from my color file, which I took years ago at an art fair. I also loved this unified stage-like treatment, but I wanted more contrast. At the end of the day, there was a given. The brown floor wasn't going to change. Finding a match was surprisingly easy, though. Benjamin Moore had the perfect color called honeycomb, number 1120. It's the one on the right, obviously. Besides, I love brown. In 2005, I had the opportunity to curate a show called Spectrum at Gallery Lalong. I wanted every color to be represented throughout the gallery. Here is Ellsworth Kelly, Karen Sander, John Beach, and Francis Cape. I actually had to make a brown painting because none of the other artists in the show had one. And here is a closer view of my piece in the show. The truth is, galleries usually don't want brown paintings. So I love the excuse of making this. It's called Silverbud, which sounds like the name of a racehorse to me. I still had to decide the color of the panels of the walls. I thought that red would be both visible and meaningful. I was thinking about the color of blood, which is vital, alive, but spooky at the same time. I sent Josh swatches of paint, so I guess at this point in lockdown, the hardware store must have been open. But would it be wet blood or dry blood? There's a big difference. After trying a couple reds, some of which looked decorative, we settled on number 1315, which is the one on the lower right. So we had the drawing down, and now we knew the colors. But how was I going to communicate the directions for the shapes? I'd only had someone execute a wall painting for me once before, and at the time I felt a little out of control. My friends were curating a show in London and wanted to avoid all shipping and custom problems. I literally faxed them the directions to make the piece, which was also a painting of paintings. And in order to avoid waste, I told them to use any paint they had on hand, and in retrospect, now that I think of it, I can't believe it turned out to be brown. This time in Houston, we started with the basics. I sent Josh instructions, and he became my hands. We were both very excited about starting. The deeper we got into details, the more I began to feel I was back to normal life. But I remember the ambulance sirens from my window in a constant stream, and they were still pretty intense. I was really impressed that Josh didn't back out when he saw this. These are the coordinate points that he would need to make the shapes. These would be, if I had received this, it would have freaked me out. But then it started to come together. Josh taped it out first. I liked this as a wall drawing, but I was eager to see it in color. And I wondered how he got the tape so straight. Tape tends to bend when it's in long pieces. Josh painted the illusion of the floor first, then the panels. For the floor, we decided to use only one coat of paint to match the uneven texture of the floor. I was so grateful to see Josh having so much fun. This is the finished painting, viewed through the windows at night. You can see the 3 panels in red, which from the proper vantage point appear to be the same width. Eventually, the illusion of that equalness shifts, and the rectangles on the sides get progressively wide and distorted. The shapes change depending on where you stood. Here, the shape is too wide on the left and too narrow on the right. Later, we realized that the gallery door acted as a 4th panel. Here's where the illusion falls apart. The viewer is looking at the gallery from the right-hand side. The failure of perspective is the underpinning of the work, as seen in the stretching of the red shapes and the funky trapezoid on the wall. And looking back, that's been a theme of mine too. I won't show as many images here, but this is just as important for understanding how the piece in Houston fits in with my work overall. Order and chaos keep coming up. These 3 images show a female figure distorted and then coming into view. The panels are here imply a progression in time and space. The effect was created by modeling the form of an avatar in simulated 3 dimensions. I turned it, just like I did with the model of the gallery. It was interesting to render a human figure in an architectural program. The curves had to be made with little straight lines in keeping with how I had made the rest of my line paintings. Also falling apart and turning, I was making jigsaw puzzles starting in 2008. The name of one of them is after Duchamp. I made a whole series of paintings based on this idea of things breaking down and becoming chaotic. They were for a show entitled And Debris in 2011. This is a recent painting. It's of shapes that appear to be thrown up into the air. So getting back to the wall painting, Josh had worked so hard, and we were both so happy about how the piece had come together, but I wasn't really done yet. I wanted to be hands-on also. It was really hard being stuck at home while Josh was having all the fun. I tried to keep myself busy by making watercolors. They were somewhat like these. The one on the right is an homage to Ruth Bader Ginsburg's black robe. I made it after she died, but I wanted to do something related to the show. As soon as I felt comfortable, I left the house and started going back to the studio. It must have been April 2020. The subways were pretty empty. There weren't many people commuting at the time. It seemed like it was only frontline workers and first responders. A lot of people weren't wearing masks because it was only a suggestion to do so. I was happy to finally get out of the house and make this work related to the gallery space. I started by coating paper with enamel and then drawing on top. This one is, the last one. This one is a direct depiction of the gallery, like an architect's blueprint. Then the only criteria for the color was that it be dark enough to show the white lines. I had already been visualizing the show in a linear way, so this work was a natural outgrowth. I made renderings of double views of the space. I'm really grateful that 2 are included in the show here at the Menil Institute. Similar to my other series, each piece is related but unique. And I got to improvise with color and line. I wanted to see layers to represent contradictory viewpoints. That's why I titled the series Here and There. Speaking of layers, I want to finish by examining the title of the wall painting. April, May, June, etc., etc. The list of months gives a sense of an ongoing freeze and danger without an end date. Time seemed to creep along when the pandemic started. I had no idea when we'd be able to resume our regular life and when my show would reopen in New York. I thought that lockdown would last maybe 4 or 5 months, and by late summer we'd be free and safe. But that wasn't the case, and here we are almost 2 years later. In essence, I could have added more months, even years, and a few more et ceteras. Upended floor means turning experience inside out, not knowing, feeling disoriented. Mud, blood is the title's final clause. It makes a playful relationship to color and ties red and brown to the most elemental of realities. To paraphrase Bill Arning's review for the show for Glass Tire, we bleed and our corpses return to earth. Josh sent me this video the night he completed the painting. While it was noisy outside on my street, he was in a calm garden in Houston. I was never able to visit and see the piece in person, but this video made me feel like I was there. Thank you for listening. I'll take questions.
I've got a mic here. Just raise your hand.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Tony. You talked at the beginning about reflection and matte surfaces, and maybe you could circle back to that, how it acted in the gallery space.
Oh, it acted...
Were there reflective surfaces and the idea of reflection? Because it also felt very much like the installation was mirroring.
Oh, you mean in the Houston show?
Yes.
We couldn't use reflective paint that was as reflective as my enamel is.
But still was the idea of continuing to play with reflection, even if, with the mirroring of the forms animating you at all?
I didn't have that luxury because we used shiny, regular house paint, which doesn't have that magical illusion. I think Edouard had a...
How significant is the idea of the blueprint for the way in which you compose your drawings and your paintings?
Oh, that particular drawing was so literal of a depiction of a shape it was so one-to-one without taking a lot of artistic liberty that I thought it was appropriate that that be a blueprint. But in general, I look at a lot of blueprints. And sometimes when I'm lost, I make an imaginary floor plan of a house that I'd like to walk around in or a museum I'd like to own. So, yeah, those are tucked away.
Sorry, I can't help it. I have a second question. Do you have an interest in virtual reality? I mean, would you like to walk into these spaces that you might imagine?
You mean with goggles?
Yes.
I think I like the retro version of the night vision better than the current phenomenon, but I've never tried it. My husband has. Yeah, it'd be pretty intense.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Do you layer, like the works that we have here, is there like a layer of paintings? Because they almost they have take on a quality of an icon, like layers of, when you scratch into them.
In the Spatial Awareness show.
Right.
There's one layer of paint on the paper that absorbs the enamel, and then the shapes on top. The second layer makes them look reflective because there's the resist of the first layer.
And are they scratched at all, or is it?
The white lines are made with a transfer process, with like a white transfer paper.
So to get back to the question of the reflection in the gallery, were there any discoveries with the glass?
Yeah, it was really hard to see the painting at certain times. You had to really peer in and look at it, but then again, I wasn't there. I just know that I got pictures of like a darkened looking space. So it was really kind of like something that you would find.
Yeah, I can imagine the garden showing up in the glass, or the person standing in front of the glass. And
definitely. Like Josh with his t-shirt.
right, exactly. The rainbow, exactly.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I'm curious to hear about all the drawings you made of the Pazda Butler wall drawing after the fact. And I'm really curious what you learned about the project post-fact, or maybe what changed in your kind of knowledge about the wall painting in going through that process of making all those drawings after.
I was just being greedy. I wanted to do something so bad, and it was such a good excuse to get back to work. And my husband didn't want me to get on the train, but I had a job to do, and that was really fun. But it just felt like a natural outgrowth rather than a reassessing of the project itself. That's a good question.
Thank you. This is more like a technical question. I would like to know how many screens did you use for those seal screens from ARFA,
Yeah.
right? For the Chinati Foundation.
I love talking about printmaking. How much time do you have? That particular project, we used one screen only. It was the beginning, and it was all based on economy. So the print itself, the size of the print was based on the half of a sheet of paper. We printed up, down, middle, turning around, up, down, middle, but nothing was planned, and we used maybe about 12 different yellows. And so it was, I'd just give the piece of paper to the printer, and he'd say, "Where do you put it?" And I'd say, "1 inch up or 2 inches down," because the size of the form was smaller than the paper itself, so we had that leeway. As far as the number of layers, I think that whenever it's done, I have an apron with a pencil in my pocket, and I put a check on the bottom if it looks done. Otherwise, it could be It could be between, for the Chinati prints, it could be between 4 and 8 layers, I would guess. But you can't kill a print by putting too much ink down. It gets a little busy and heavy. Yeah, you're welcome.
Hi, good evening. My name is Julio Luna, and I have a technical questions about your the perspective, because I see you use perspective a lot.
Yeah.
From your own point of view, how important is to know how to use perspective as an artist, but also how important is for everybody, not just you, but everybody as an artist to use perspective really well. Also color too, you know?
It's a good question. I don't think it's important for everybody, but it's important for me because it orients me in relationship to what I'm looking at, and it might orient somebody else. So I'm not an artist who, renders pictures per se, but the lines of the perspective will kind of ground me in that space and also act as an abstract element. So in all of these, even in the figure drawing triptych that I showed you, there is perspective there, even though she turns and she falls apart, because there is a vanishing point that's implied technically in there. Does that answer your question?
I would like to know from your own point of view, how important is perspective to learn perspective? Not just you, of course, perspective, right, but some other artists. You think it's important to other artists to understand perspective or not?
I think if you have a curiosity for it, yeah. But there's so many skills I don't have we pick our battles, we pick our toolbox, so to speak. Okay, good. I think you're off the hook then.
We've got time for one more question here, and then the show is open. Just want to remind everybody.
Oh, hi. I really enjoyed your talk. I was wondering, you said that you also had a show at Rice, and I went to a talk there about Solowit and how they painted the mural, the Solowit mural, by his step-by-step instructions. And that made me think about what you did with the gallerist here. Yeah. And how does that make you feel as an artist in terms of, is that still very much your work, or do you kind of let go, or, in terms of comparing yourself to the works of a Solowit and, how he had to leave instructions?
Yeah, it's such a good question. Solowit's instructions are like poems in and of themselves. They're so concise, and you can't misinterpret what he's saying. So I think his language itself is part of the artwork, which I've always admired. I don't feel that for me, it's a relationship, which is not necessarily primarily a verbal experience, but it's more of a collaboration. It was interesting to fax those instructions, though, to London, and it was at a time when there were long distance fees, so you couldn't just pick up the phone. And describing a process to somebody else is really hard, making a recipe for something. So it's important to do it a couple times so that you can read it and find out whether you can understand your own words. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Anybody else? Hi.
Coming.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. And you mentioned several times during your presentation the collaboration with Josh, for instance, but also the collaboration with this person in Palestine. And of course, having seen you work day after day and working with the two wonderful wall painters from Ohio at Rice University,
right,
there was also this wonderful collaboration that took place. Could you maybe say something about this collaborative aspect of your work? How you alternate between it?
Well, it's funny. I wanted to talk about my parents today, but I didn't. But my father was one of the beginning people of improvisational theater. He started the Compass, which turned into Second City, and that turned into everything else. So I feel I'm very shy to be looked at. Like, this is really hard for me. But I really enjoy that experience of working off of the other person. So I think that came very much from my background. And there was something magical about hiring those people from Ohio and having an email exchange, but really having to jump into the void and not knowing really what their skill set was. And it turned out really well. And in that instance, which you witnessed, I had to back off and just watch them do what they did best and then color correct them along the way, but have a really, really fine balance between letting somebody have authority, and that's fun. And Anise does that too on when we're working together. Kate, I would like to try something. Give me a moment. Questions? Are there any more questions?
When you talked about the extruded shapes, the triangular shapes that were kind of extruded, and it was like somebody trying to get out.
Oh, yeah.
Does that recall any of your childhood memories of dressing in red shoes,
Yeah.
red dress, and red tights? Is there a relationship there, somebody trying to get out?
Oh, sure. No, it was, you're an architect, so there's this is a really fine line of making this architectural form, which I kept taking apart again and again and again, so it would be unrecognizable, but recognizable at the same time, but to me privately, which is why I made the pose for you, because you would never see it as a figure if I didn't show you that. So there's something hiddenly human about that, and maybe that's the most personal thing about that work for me.
Thank you so much, Kate.
Thank you.